The gunshot that tore through the silence of the New Mexico desert nearly made Grace Nolan drop her sketchbook into the dirt. But she had learned long ago to keep steady hands no matter what chaos erupted around her. It was 1878, and the territory between Las Cruces and the small settlement of Hachita was no place for a woman alone. Yet here she sat on a sun-bleached rock, charcoal pencil moving across paper, as she captured the delicate purple petals of a desert marigold that had somehow found life in this harsh landscape. She did not look up at the sound. Men shot at things out here all the time, whether rattlesnakes or rabbits or each other, and Grace had discovered that minding her own business kept her alive. The wildflower before her mattered more than whatever violence brewed in the distance. In the curve of each petal, in the way the stem bent slightly toward the sun, she found something true and honest that the world of men could never provide. "You might want to move along, miss." The voice came from behind her, rough as sandpaper but not unkind. Grace finally looked up, shading her eyes against the brutal afternoon sun. The man sat atop a bay horse, dusty from trail riding, with a face that looked like it had seen 30 hard years. His hat was pulled low, but she could see dark hair beneath it and eyes that might have been green or might have been brown in this light. He wore no badge, but he carried himself with the weariness of someone who had enforced law or broken it, maybe both. "I am quite comfortable where I am, thank you," Grace said, returning her attention to her sketch. She added another shadow beneath the flower's leaves, pleased with how the dimension was emerging on the flat page. "There are cattle rustlers about 2 miles west. They just shot at a ranch hand who got too curious about their activities. They are heading this direction. Then I suggest you ride in a different direction yourself." Grace blew excess charcoal dust from her paper and tilted her head, examining her work with a critical eye. The flower needed more definition in its center. The man made a sound that might have been frustration or amusement. "You have a strange way of preserving your own life. And you have a strange way of wasting time arguing with someone you have just met." Grace looked up again and this time really studied him. He had a strong jaw shadowed with stubble, and yes, his eyes were definitely green, startling against his sun-darkened skin. There was something lonely about him, something that sat in the set of his shoulders like an old friend he could not shake. "If there is genuine danger, either help me or ride on, but stop trying to manage me with words." That definitely got a reaction. His eyebrows rose and he swung down from his horse with an easy grace that spoke of years in the saddle. He was tall, well over 6 feet, and carried a Colt revolver at his hip with the casual comfort of someone who knew how to use it. "Zachary Olsen," he said, not offering his hand but giving her his name like it was a test. "Grace Nolan." She did not offer her hand either, but she did shift slightly on her rock to make space, an invitation he had not asked for. Zachary stood there for a moment, clearly uncertain what to make of her. Most women he encountered probably did what they were told, probably fled at the first sign of danger. Grace could see the calculation in his eyes as he tried to sort her into a category that made sense. She knew he would fail. She had never fit anyone's expectations. "What are you doing out here alone?" he asked finally, moving closer to look at her sketchbook. She did not hide it, turning it slightly so he could see the careful rendering of the wildflower. "Exactly what it appears I am doing. Sketching." "That is a marigold. Desert marigold, yes. Baelia multiradiata if you prefer the scientific name." Grace glanced at the actual flower, then back at her paper. "They bloom even in drought. Something about them feels like hope." Zachary crouched down beside her rock, studying not the flower but her face now. "You talk like someone educated. Is that a crime in New Mexico territory? For a woman alone in the desert, It is certainly unusual. Grace set down her charcoal and met his eyes directly. I came from Boston 3 months ago. My father died and left me a small inheritance, enough to travel, not enough to matter to anyone who might try to take it. I have been moving through the territories drawing plants, insects, birds, anything that catches my attention. I sell some sketches to botanical journals back east, enough to keep me fed. I stay in small towns, pay for rooms in boarding houses when they are available, sleep under the stars when they are not. I bother no one and I break no laws. Is there anything else you need to interrogate from me, Mr. Olsen? Something shifted in his expression, a wall coming down brick by brick. I apologize. I did not mean to interrogate. I only meant that I have been riding through this territory for 5 years, and I have never met anyone quite like you. And what do you do in your riding through this territory? Whatever pays. Zachary stood up and scanned the horizon, his hand resting on his gun belt. Right now, I am supposed to be tracking a gang that has been hitting ranches between here and the Arizona border. I am not exactly law, but the ranchers pooled money for someone to handle their problem. A hired gun. A problem solver. He looked back down at her. And right now, you are becoming part of my problem, because those rustlers are definitely heading this way, and I cannot just ride off and leave you here. Grace considered this. She had promised herself when she left Boston that she would not allow men to dictate her movements, but she also was not foolish enough to court death unnecessarily. How many rustlers? 4 that I have counted. And you are one man. I am one man who is very good at what he does. There was no arrogance in the statement, just fact. Grace studied him again and saw the truth of it in the easy way he held himself, the confidence that came from surviving when others had not. Very well. I will move, but I am not fleeing like some frightened rabbit. I will relocate to that outcropping there. She pointed to a cluster of red rocks about 100 yards north, where I can continue my work in relative safety while you handle your business. That outcropping is exactly where I plan to position myself for the best vantage point. Then I suppose we will be sharing space. Grace gathered her things, tucking her sketchbook into the worn leather satchel she carried everywhere. She had other completed sketches in there, weeks of work that represented the only thing in her life that felt like it had meaning. Zachary looked like he wanted to argue further, but something stopped him. Maybe it was the set of her jaw, or maybe it was something else, some recognition that arguing with Grace Nolan was a battle he would not win. Stay behind the rocks and do not make a sound, no matter what you hear. I am not a fool, Mr. Olsen. Call me Zachary. If we are going to share space, we might as well be informal about it. They moved together toward the outcropping, Zachary leading his horse and Grace walking beside him with her skirts held up enough to keep from tripping. The desert stretched around them in shades of brown and gold, punctuated by the stubborn green of creosote bushes and the occasional burst of wildflowers that refused to acknowledge how hostile their environment was. Grace understood those flowers. She felt a kinship with anything that bloomed where it was not supposed to. The rocks provided good cover, and Zachary positioned his horse on the far side where it would be out of sight. Grace settled herself in a small hollow between 2 boulders and pulled out her sketchbook again, this time turning to a fresh page. She had spotted a lizard earlier, one of those beautiful collared lizards with turquoise markings, and she wanted to try to render it from memory. You are actually going to draw, Zachary said, positioning himself where he could see the approaching riders while still maintaining cover. Did you think I was lying? I thought you might be more concerned with the men coming to potentially kill us. Grace began sketching the basic shape of the lizard's head. You said you are very good at what you do. I am choosing to believe you. If I am wrong, I will die with charcoal on my fingers while doing something I love. There are worse ways to go." She heard him make that sound again, the one that was half frustration and half amusement. For several minutes they sat in silence, Grace working on her sketch and Zachary watching the desert. The sun beat down relentlessly, and Grace could feel sweat trickling down her spine beneath her simple cotton dress. She had long ago abandoned the complicated layers of Eastern fashion. Out here, practicality mattered more than propriety. "Why plants?" Zachary asked suddenly, his voice quiet. "Why not people or landscapes?" Grace added detail to the lizard's scales, tiny careful marks that would give texture to the drawing. "Because plants do not lie. They are exactly what they appear to be. A flower blooms or it does not. A tree grows toward the sun or it dies. There is an honesty in that simplicity that I find comforting. People are complicated. People are exhausting." Grace looked up from her work to find him watching her instead of the horizon. "They want things from you. They expect you to be a certain way, to fit into their understanding of how the world should work. Plants just exist. They do not judge." Zachary turned his attention back to the desert. "That sounds like someone who has been judged quite a bit." "I was engaged once," Grace said, surprising herself with the admission. She never talked about Boston, about the life she had left behind. "To a very proper banker's son. He liked that I drew, thought it was a charming hobby for a wife. Until he actually looked at my work and realized I was serious about it. Then it became unseemly. Too passionate. He suggested I take up needlework instead, something more appropriate." "What did you do?" I broke off the engagement. My father was furious. "He said I was throwing away my future for a childish fantasy. We fought terribly." Grace's hand slowed on the page. "He died 2 weeks later, a heart attack. We never reconciled. That is not your fault. I know that in my head, but in my heart I wonder if the stress of my defiance contributed. If I killed him by refusing to be the daughter he wanted." Zachary was quiet for a moment. "My father wanted me to be a farmer. We had land in Missouri, good land. He could not understand why I wanted to leave, why sitting still felt like dying to me. We fought too. He said I was throwing away everything he had built. I left anyway, came west, and I have been moving ever since. He died 5 years ago and I was in Texas when it happened. Never got to say goodbye, never got to tell him that I understood what he was trying to give me, even if I could not accept it." Grace looked at him with new understanding. "We are both running, then. Maybe, or maybe we are both just trying to find something we can live with." The sound of approaching horses cut off any further conversation. Zachary raised a hand in warning and Grace set down her sketchbook, pressing herself back against the rocks. She could hear the jingle of tack, the low voices of men who thought they were alone in the desert. 4 riders came into view, rough-looking men with the hard eyes of those who had chosen to live outside the law. They were leading several horses that Grace assumed were stolen, and they were riding with the casual confidence of people who did not expect to be challenged. They passed within 50 yards of the outcropping, close enough that Grace could hear fragments of their conversation. "Should have killed that ranch hand instead of just winging him," one of them said. A man with a scarred face and a Confederate cavalry hat that had seen better days. "Dead bodies bring more law than wounded ones," another replied. "We just need to get these horses across the border and we are home free." Zachary let them pass. Grace watched him watch them, saw the calculation in his eyes. He was outnumbered and he knew it. A smart man would let them go, would report their direction to whatever passed for law in this part of the territory. But Grace could see something else in his face too, a weariness with letting bad men ride away, a accumulated frustration with a world that might make right. "Stay here," he whispered to her. No matter what happens, stay quiet and stay hidden. You cannot take 4 men alone. Watch me." He moved before she could protest further, swinging up onto his horse with practiced ease. Grace wanted to call out to stop him, but that would only put him in more danger. So she pressed her hand against her mouth and watched as Zachary rode out from behind the rocks, positioning himself directly in the path of the rustlers who had passed. "You men are under arrest for cattle theft," his voice carried across the desert, strong and sure. The 4 rustlers wheeled their horses around, hands going to their guns. The scarred man laughed. "Under arrest? You are not law. You are just one stupid bounty hunter who does not know when to mind his own business. The ranchers hired me to stop you. That makes it my business. You can come peacefully or you can die here. Your choice." Grace's heart hammered against her ribs. She had seen violence before, had witnessed the casual brutality that men inflicted on each other. But she had never cared before whether the outcome touched her personally. Now she found herself desperately afraid for this lonely cowboy who had tried to protect a stranger sketching flowers in the desert. The scarred man went for his gun first. Zachary was faster. The shot cracked across the landscape and the rustler fell from his horse, clutching his shoulder. The other 3 spread out, trying to flank Zachary, but he wheeled his horse in a tight circle, keeping them in his line of sight. "Next man who draws gets a bullet in the chest, not the shoulder," Zachary said calmly. For a moment it seemed like the standoff might end peacefully. Then the youngest of the rustlers, a boy who could not have been more than 20, panicked and fired wildly. His bullet went wide, but it was enough to trigger chaos. 2 more shots rang out and Grace saw Zachary jerk in his saddle. He returned fire, hitting another rustler in the leg, and then the remaining 2 were spurring their horses and fleeing, abandoning their wounded companions and the stolen horses. Zachary slumped forward, and Grace was moving before she thought about it, running across the open ground toward him. His horse sidestepped nervously as she approached, but she caught the reins, steadying the animal while reaching up to help Zachary. Blood spread across his left side, a dark stain against his shirt. "I told you to stay hidden," he said through gritted teeth. "And I told you I am not good at following orders." Grace helped him down from his horse, taking more of his weight than she expected to be able to manage. Adrenaline gave her strength as she guided him back toward the rocks. The wounded rustlers were moaning in the dirt, but Grace ignored them. Let them tend to their own injuries. Her concern was for the man who had tried to protect her. She got Zachary settled in the shade of the outcropping and quickly unbuttoned his shirt to examine the wound. The bullet had grazed his ribs, tearing a furrow through his skin but not penetrating deep. He would have a scar, but he would live, assuming she could stop the bleeding and infection did not set in. "My canteen," Zachary gestured weakly toward his horse. "And there is a medical kit in my saddlebag." Grace retrieved both, her hands surprisingly steady now that there was a practical problem to solve. She had helped treat injuries before, back in Boston when she had volunteered at a hospital to sketch medical illustrations for training manuals. The doctors had been shocked at first by her presence in the surgical theater, but they had quickly realized she had a strong stomach and steady hands. She cleaned the wound with water from the canteen, then used strips torn from her petticoat to create bandages. Zachary watched her work with an expression that was hard to read. "You have done this before," he said. "I have drawn it being done, which is almost the same thing." Grace pressed the bandage firmly against his side, making him wince. "You were a fool to take on 4 men alone." "Probably." "Definitely. You could have been killed. People keep trying to kill me. So far I have been faster or luckier or both." Grace tied off the bandage and sat back on her heels. Her dress was covered in his blood and her hair had come loose from its pins, hanging around her shoulders in tangled waves. She probably looked wild and improper, and everything her Boston social circle would have condemned. She did not care. "Thank you," Zachary said quietly, "for helping me. Thank you for trying to protect me, however foolishly you went about it." He smiled at that, a real smile that transformed his tired face into something almost boyish. "Are we going to insult each other every time we express gratitude? It seems to be working well so far." They stayed in the outcropping until the worst of the heat had passed. The two wounded rustlers eventually managed to climb onto horses and ride away, leaving a trail of blood drops in the dirt. Grace let them go. She had no interest in trying to hold prisoners, and Zachary was in no condition to do anything about it. The stolen horses milled about, grazing on whatever sparse vegetation they could find. As the sun began to sink toward the western horizon, painting the desert in shades of gold and amber, Grace pulled out her sketchbook again. But this time, instead of drawing plants, she found herself sketching Zachary as he dozed against the rocks, his face relaxed in sleep, looking younger and more at peace than he had while awake. There was something about the line of his jaw, the way his dark hair fell across his forehead, the strength in his shoulders even in repose that called to her artist's eye. But it was more than that, she admitted to herself as her charcoal moved across the page. It was the loneliness she recognized in him, the same isolation that had driven her into the desert to draw wildflowers instead of staying in civilization. They were both people who did not quite fit, who had chosen the honest harshness of the wilderness over the complicated lies of society. Zachary woke as the light began to fade, grimacing as he shifted position. "We need to move. It is not safe to stay here after dark. Can you ride? I have ridden with worse injuries." He struggled to his feet, leaning heavily on the rocks for support. Grace moved to help him, but he waved her off. "I can manage. Your pride is going to get you killed one of these days. Probably." They gathered the stolen horses, tying them in a string behind Zachary's mount, and began the slow journey toward Hachita. Grace walked beside Zachary's horse, keeping close in case he fell. The desert transformed as darkness fell, the oppressive heat giving way to a chill that made Grace wish she had brought a shawl. The stars emerged one by one, more than she had ever seen in Boston, so many they looked like spilled salt across black velvet. "Tell me more about your drawings," Zachary said after they had been riding for an hour. His voice was strained with pain but steady. "What do you want to know?" "Why wildflowers? Out of everything in the world you could document, why those?" Grace thought about the question as she navigated the dark trail. "Because they are survivors. They exist in places that should kill them. They bloom even when conditions are terrible, and they find beauty in simplicity. Every petal has a purpose. Every stem serves a function. There is no artifice, no pretension. They are real in a way that very little in my old life was real." "Your fiancé, the banker's son, did you love him?" "I thought I did. But looking back, I think I loved the idea of him, the escape he represented from my father's control. I did not know him, not really. We talked about surface things, weather and social engagements in which families were rising or falling in society's estimation. We never talked about what mattered. What matters? That question exactly. What brings you joy? What breaks your heart? What would you die for? What would you kill for? What would you give up everything to protect? Those are the questions that tell you who someone actually is." Zachary was quiet for a moment. "You would have been wasted on a banker's son." "I know that now. I did not know it then." Grace looked up at him in the starlight. "What about you? Have you ever been in love?" "I thought so once. A farmer's daughter back in Missouri. Pretty girl with blonde braids and a sweet smile. She said she loved me too, said she would wait for me while I went west to make my fortune. I believed her. His voice went flat. I came back 2 years later with money in my pocket and plans to marry her. She had been married for 18 months to the boy who inherited the farm next to her father's. She told me she could not wait forever for a man who could not sit still. That must have hurt terribly. It did. But she was right. I could not sit still then, and I cannot sit still now. I would have made her miserable. Better that she married someone who could give her the life she wanted. They reached Hachita after midnight, a small collection of adobe buildings and wooden structures that served as a way station between larger settlements. Zachary knew the man who ran the town's only boarding house, a grizzled former cavalry soldier named Tom who asked no questions when they arrived. He gave them 2 rooms upstairs and promised to tend to the stolen horses until Zachary could return them to their rightful owners. Grace helped Zachary up the narrow stairs, her arm around his waist as he leaned on her more heavily than he probably wanted to admit. His room was small and spare, just a bed, a washstand, and a chair. She eased him down onto the bed and checked his bandages. Blood had seeped through, but not as much as she had feared. "You should rest," she said. "I will check on you in the morning." His hand caught her wrist as she turned to leave. "Grace, why did you help me? You did not know me. You could have let me handle my own mess." She looked down at his hand on her wrist, at the calluses on his palm and the strength in his fingers. "Because when you looked at my drawing of that wildflower, you knew what it was. Not just that it was a marigold, but the scientific name. You saw what I saw in it, the hope in something that blooms in harsh conditions. Most people look at my work and see decoration. You looked and saw what I was actually trying to capture. The beauty in simple things. Yes, that is rare enough that it is worth saving." She left him then, returning to her own room where she stripped off her blood-stained dress and washed as best she could with the cold water in the basin. But she could not sleep. She kept thinking about Zachary in the next room, kept replaying the moment when she saw him jerk in the saddle, kept feeling the terror that had seized her at the thought of him dying. She barely knew him. They had spent less than a day together. But something had shifted in her. Some wall she had built around herself after her father's death, and the broken engagement had developed a crack. She had thought she wanted to be alone with her art, that people would only complicate and disappoint. But there was something about the lonely cowboy who appreciated wildflowers that made her reconsider what she had decided about the world. She finally fell asleep as dawn light began to creep through her window, and when she woke, it was late morning. She dressed quickly in a clean dress, brushed and repinned her hair, and went to check on Zachary. She knocked softly on his door and heard his voice telling her to enter. He was sitting up in bed, shirtless, trying to change his own bandages and making a mess of it. Grace crossed the room and took over without asking permission, unwrapping the bloodied cloths and examining the wound. It looked clean, no signs of infection yet, and the bleeding had stopped. She redressed it with steady hands while trying not to notice the lean muscle of his chest and shoulders, the map of old scars that spoke of a hard life. "You should have called for me," she said. "I did not want to presume on your time. After I spent yesterday digging a bullet crease out of your side, I think we are past the point of presuming." Grace finished tying off the fresh bandage and stepped back. "How do you feel?" "Like I got shot, which is accurate." He stood up carefully, testing his mobility. "But I have had worse. I need to return those horses and collect the bounty money from the ranchers. You need to rest. I need to work. Rest does not pay for room and board." Grace wanted to argue, but she understood. She had been living on the thin margin between solvency and poverty for 3 months now. Every dollar mattered when you had no family support and no steady income. "Then at least let me come with you. Someone should be there to catch you if you fall off your horse. That is not necessary. Neither was you protecting me yesterday, but you did it anyway. Perhaps we should both stop arguing about what is necessary and start accepting help when it is offered." That got another smile from him, and Grace realized she was becoming addicted to the sight of it. He had smiled more in the past day than he probably had in months, and she liked being the person who prompted that reaction. They spent the next week in and around Hachita while Zachary healed. He returned the stolen horses and collected his bounty, visited the ranchers who had hired him to discuss the remaining rustlers who had escaped, and generally conducted his business while Grace sketched. She found an entire meadow of paper flowers just outside town, delicate white blooms that opened in the morning and closed at night, and she spent hours documenting them from every angle. But she also found herself drawing Zachary. He would be talking to ranchers and she would sketch his profile. He would be checking his horse's shoes and she would capture the bend of his shoulders. He would be eating dinner across from her at the boarding house's common table, and she would memorize the way his hands moved as he talked. She was creating a catalog of him without meaning to, storing away details like a miser hoarding gold. They talked more during that week than Grace had talked to anyone in months. She told him about growing up in Boston, about her mother who had died when Grace was 12, and left her alone with a father who did not understand her. She told him about the hospital where she had sketched medical procedures, about the way blood and bone and viscera had not disturbed her the way it disturbed other women, and how that had been another mark against her in society's judgment. Zachary told her about Missouri, about learning to ride and shoot before he could properly write, about the restlessness that had driven him west. He told her about working as a ranch hand, a trail guide, a town deputy for a few months until the politics became unbearable, anything that kept him moving and kept him useful. He told her about sleeping under stars and learning to read the land, about near misses with death and distant friendships with other wanderers. "You ever get tired of moving?" Grace asked one evening as they sat outside the boarding house watching the sun set. "Every day," Zachary admitted. "But then I think about staying in one place and I feel like I cannot breathe. It is like there is something broken in me, something that cannot settle." Maybe it is not broken. Maybe it is just different. Grace had her sketchbook out, drawing the way the sunset light hit the distant mountains. Not everyone is meant to plant roots. Some people are meant to be dandelion seeds, spreading far and finding new ground. What about you? Will you keep moving forever? Grace considered the question. "I do not know. I left Boston because I had to, because staying felt like dying slowly. But I do not know if this is permanent wandering or just an extended journey to figure out who I am without all the expectations weighing on me." "And have you figured it out?" "I have figured out that I like who I am when no one is watching. I like the woman who sits in the desert drawing flowers and does not apologize for finding that fulfilling. Whether that woman can exist anywhere other than alone in the wilderness, I have not determined yet." Zachary reached over and took her sketchbook, studying her latest drawing of the mountains. "You have real talent. These are not just amateur sketches. This is professional work. The botanical journals pay me $20 for a full plate, which means multiple detailed drawings of a single plant species showing different growth stages and anatomical details. It takes me about a week to complete one plate if I work steadily. That is not enough to live on long term, but it is enough for now." $20, Zachary said thoughtfully. "That is what I got for stopping those rustlers and nearly getting killed in the process. Our society values violence over beauty. That is not exactly news." "No, I suppose it is not." He handed back her sketchbook. "But for what it is worth, I think what you do matters. There will always be men willing to shoot at each other. There are not many people who can capture why a thing is worth preserving in the first place. Something warm bloomed in Grace's chest, something dangerous and wonderful and terrifying. She had told herself she was done with men, done with the complications of caring about someone whose life might pull them in directions she could not follow. But Zachary kept saying things that reached past her defenses, kept seeing her in ways that made her feel understood for the first time in her life. By the end of the week, Zachary's wound had healed enough that he could move without wincing. He announced he needed to ride north to Silver City to meet with a mine owner who needed security for a payroll shipment. It was good money, the kind of job he could not turn down. He would be gone at least 2 weeks, possibly longer. Grace felt his impending departure like a physical ache. They stood outside the boarding house on the morning he was set to leave, his horse already saddled and ready. The early light painted everything gold and made Zachary's green eyes look almost luminous. "You should stay here in Hatchita," he said. "Tom will let you keep your room for a fair price, and it is safer than wandering. Are you giving me orders again? I am making a suggestion based on concern for your welfare. How diplomatic of you." They stood looking at each other, neither quite willing to say what needed to be said. Finally, Zachary cleared his throat. "I will be back. 2 weeks, maybe 3 at most. If you are still here when I return, maybe we could have dinner. A real one, not just whatever Tom is serving at the common table." "That sounds suspiciously like you are courting me, Mr. Olsen." "Would that be unwelcome?" Grace thought about her vows to stay independent, to avoid the complications of romance. Then she thought about the way he had tried to protect her from rustlers, the way he looked at her drawings and understood what she was trying to capture, the way his loneliness called to hers like a voice across a canyon. No, it would not be unwelcome at all. His smile was worth every compromise of her principles. "Then I will count the days until I return." He swung up into his saddle, grimacing only slightly from the lingering pain in his side. Grace watched him ride out of town, watched until he was just a dot on the northern horizon, and felt something shift in her heart. She had spent 3 months telling herself she did not need anyone, that art was enough, that solitude was freedom. But watching Zachary leave, she realized that freedom could also be choosing to let someone matter, choosing to risk the pain of loss for the possibility of connection. She spent the next 2 weeks in a creative frenzy. She documented every plant within 5 miles of Hatchita, filled 3 entire sketchbooks with detailed drawings. She hiked into the nearby mountains and sketched the way pine trees grew from rocks, found a hidden spring where columbines bloomed in impossible shades of red and yellow. She worked until her hands cramped and her eyes burned, trying to keep herself too busy to count the days until Zachary returned. But at night, alone in her room, she pulled out the sketches she had made of him and studied them in the lamplight. She had captured something in those drawings, some essential quality of who he was. The loneliness, yes, but also the strength, the kindness, the dry humor that surfaced when he felt safe enough to let it show. She had thought she was documenting the external details of his appearance, but somehow she had also captured what it felt like to be in his presence, the sense of being seen and understood without judgment. She was falling in love with him. The realization hit her one night as she sat looking at a drawing of his hands, the way she had captured the calluses and scars and the gentleness with which he had handled her sketches. She was falling in love, and there was nothing simple or safe about it. He was a man who lived by violence, who might be killed any day doing the dangerous work he did. He was a wanderer who could not sit still, who might wake up one morning and decide to ride for California and never look back. There was no security in loving him, no promise of the kind of stable future that society said she should want. But Grace found she did not care about stability or security or society's approval. She had left all that behind in Boston. What she wanted was to feel alive, to feel understood, to find someone who saw beauty in the same simple things she did. And that person was Zachary, for however long fate allowed them to be in each other's lives. He returned on a Tuesday afternoon, 18 days after he had left. Grace was sitting outside the boarding house, sketching a mockingbird that had been singing from the roof, when she heard the distinctive rhythm of his horse's gait. She looked up, and there he was, dusty from travel but whole and alive, and the relief that flooded through her was almost painful in its intensity. Zachary dismounted and walked toward her, and Grace set down her sketchbook and stood to meet him. They stopped a few feet apart, suddenly awkward despite the easy friendship they had built before he left. "You are still here," he said. "Did you think I would not be? I worried you might have moved on. You could sketch anywhere." "You did not have any reason to wait in a dusty little town in the middle of nowhere," Grace smiled. "I had a reason. You promised me dinner." Something in his expression shifted, warmth filling his eyes. "I did promise that. Are you free this evening?" "I believe my social calendar is completely empty." They went to dinner at the only restaurant in Hachita that could claim to serve actual cuisine rather than just trail food. It was still rough by Boston standards. A adobe building with wooden tables and chairs that did not match, but the proprietor was a Mexican woman who cooked with skill and passion, and the food was the best Grace had eaten since leaving the East. They talked through the meal, trading stories about the past 2 weeks. Zachary told her about the mine payroll job, about riding through Apache territory, and making it through with a combination of luck and careful negotiation with a band of warriors who might have attacked a less respectful traveler. Grace told him about the columbines she had found, about completing 2 botanical plates that she would send to journals in Boston and Philadelphia. But underneath the surface conversation, there was something else building, a tension that was not unpleasant but was certainly undeniable. Grace kept noticing details about Zachary she had not allowed herself to see before. The way his shirt stretched across his shoulders, the way his voice dropped lower when he was talking just to her, the way he looked at her like she was more interesting than anything else in the world. When dinner was finished and they stepped out into the cool evening air, Zachary offered her his arm. Grace took it, allowing herself the pleasure of walking close to him through Hachita's quiet streets. The town was settling into night, lamps being lit in windows, the sound of a harmonica drifting from the saloon. "I thought about you every day," Zachary said suddenly. "The whole time I was gone, I kept seeing things and thinking about how you would sketch them, what you would notice that I would miss. It was like you had taught me to see differently, to pay attention to small, beautiful things instead of just watching for danger." "What kinds of things?" Grace asked softly. A butterfly landing on a cactus flower, the pattern of erosion in red rock, the way morning light hit a stand of aspens, things I have ridden past 1,000 times without really seeing. He stopped walking and turned to face her. "You changed something in me, Grace. You made me aware of how much beauty I have been missing while I focused on just surviving." "You changed something in me too," Grace admitted. "I told myself I wanted to be alone, that people would only disappoint or constrain me, but you never tried to make me smaller or safer. You liked that I sat in the desert sketching wildflowers even when it was dangerous. You appreciated what I create instead of seeing it as a threat to your ideas about how a woman should behave. Why would I want you to be anything other than exactly who you are?" It was such a simple question, such an obvious truth, but it cracked something open in Grace's chest. Her father had wanted her to be more conventional. Her former fiancé had wanted her to be more decorative. Everyone in her old life had wanted her to be less intense, less passionate, less herself. But here was this lonely cowboy in the middle of the New Mexico desert who looked at her and saw someone complete, someone who did not need fixing or managing or molding into something more acceptable. "I am falling in love with you," she said, the words escaping before she could reconsider them. "I did not mean to. I had no intention of it, but I cannot seem to stop." Zachary's hand came up to cup her face, his calloused palm warm against her cheek. "Then do not stop. Please do not stop." "Because I started falling in love with you the moment I saw you on that rock, so focused on capturing a wildflower that you did not care about rustlers or danger or anything except getting the shading right on the petals. I have never met anyone like you, Grace. I do not want to lose you. I am not easy to love. I am stubborn and independent, and I will never stop sketching, never stop needing to create." "Good. I am not easy to love either. I cannot stay still. I take dangerous jobs, and I might get shot again at any moment. We are both difficult people." "Maybe that means we are right for each other." Grace laughed, the sound escaping as relief and joy combined. "That is terrible logic. It is the best logic I have." He kissed her then, right there on the street where anyone might see, and Grace kissed him back with all the passion she had been told to suppress her entire life. His arms came around her, and she pressed against him, feeling the solid strength of his body and the rapid beat of his heart that matched her own. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Grace felt like she had been remade, like some fundamental piece of herself had finally clicked into place. "Marry me," Zachary said, the words rough and urgent. "I know it is too fast. I know we have only known each other a few weeks, but marry me anyway. We can figure out the details as we go." Grace should have said no. Every rational part of her brain insisted this was madness, that you did not marry a man after a few weeks no matter how right it felt. But rationality had never served her particularly well. Rationality had told her to marry the banker's son, to give up sketching, to be the proper Boston daughter her father wanted. Rationality was what had made her miserable. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I will marry you." They were married 3 days later by a traveling preacher who passed through Hatchita on his circuit. It was a simple ceremony with Tom and his wife as witnesses, nothing like the elaborate wedding Grace would have had in Boston. She wore a simple yellow dress and had wildflowers in her hair that she had picked herself that morning. Zachary wore his best shirt and looked nervous in a way she had never seen him, like he still could not quite believe she had said yes. The preacher pronounced them married, and they kissed as husband and wife, and Grace felt a certainty settle over her that had nothing to do with logic or rationality. This was right. This lonely cowboy who appreciated the beauty in simple things was right. Whatever challenges came next, they would face them together. They spent their wedding night in Zachary's room at the boarding house, which became their room now, their first shared space. Grace was nervous despite her usual confidence, aware that this was yet another line she was crossing, another way she was choosing her own path instead of following prescribed rules. But Zachary was gentle and patient, and the awkwardness of newness gave way to genuine connection, to the joy of discovery and intimacy that felt like coming home. Afterward, they lay tangled in sheets as moonlight spilled through the window, and Grace traced the old scars on Zachary's chest with curious fingers. "Tell me about these," she said. "That one is from a knife fight in Tucson. That one is from a barbed wire fence I did not see in the dark. That one is from a bullet that came too close in a range war up in Colorado." He caught her hand and pressed a kiss to her palm. "What about you? What marks do you carry?" Nothing so dramatic. A burn scar on my arm from a cooking accident when I was 10, calluses on my fingers from charcoal and pencils, a small scar on my knee from falling out of a tree when I was supposed to be acting like a lady. Grace smiled at the memory. My father was furious. He said young women did not climb trees. I told him that young women should be allowed to see what birds saw. We fought about it for days. I would have liked to see you as a child. I bet you were fierce. I was lonely mostly. I did not fit with other children. They wanted to play games that seemed pointless to me. I wanted to sit and watch ants build colonies, sketch the architecture of spider webs, understand how things worked. The other children thought I was strange. You are strange, Zachary said, but his tone made it clear he meant it as the highest compliment. You are strange and brilliant and beautiful, and I cannot believe you agreed to marry me. I cannot believe you asked. You could have just kept moving, taken another job in another town, and added me to your list of pleasant memories from the road. No. His hand tightened on hers. No, you were never going to be just a memory. From that first moment, watching you draw that marigold like nothing else in the world mattered, I knew you were going to change my life. I just did not know how yet. They fell asleep wrapped around each other, and Grace dreamed of wildflowers blooming in impossible places, their roots finding purchase in stone, their petals bright against the harsh desert landscape. She woke feeling more rested than she had in months, like some tension she had been carrying had finally released. The question of what came next had to be addressed. Zachary's work took him all over the territory, and Grace needed to be able to sketch plants in different locations for her botanical work. After several long conversations, they developed a plan that felt workable if unconventional. They would travel together when Zachary's jobs allowed it, and Grace would sketch whatever plants she found in each new location. When Zachary took jobs that were too dangerous for Grace to accompany him, she would stay in a safe town and work on completing her botanical plates from sketches she had already made. It was not a traditional marriage by any measure. They would not have a permanent home, no white picket fence, no stable domestic routine. But it would allow both of them to continue doing work that mattered while building a life together. Grace would not have to give up her art, and Zachary would not have to betray his restless nature by trying to settle. They could be themselves together, which seemed far more valuable than any conventional arrangement. They spent the next several months establishing the rhythm of their new life. Zachary took a job escorting a freight wagon train from Hachita to Lordsburg, and Grace rode with him, sketching the plants they encountered along the route. She documented prickly pear cacti in bloom, a patchy plume with its delicate white flowers, the deep purple of desert penstemon. In Lordsburg, while Zachary conducted his business, Grace met with the wife of the local doctor who was an amateur botanist and spent a fascinating afternoon comparing notes on native plant species. From Lordsburg, they traveled north to Silver City, then east to Socorro. Each town brought new plants to document, new landscapes to explore. Grace sent completed botanical plates back to Boston and Philadelphia and began receiving more commissions. Editors wanted specific species documented, wanted illustrations for articles about Western flora, wanted her unique perspective on plants that most people dismissed as scrub or weeds. Her work began to gain recognition beyond just botanical journals. A publisher in New York wrote asking if she would be interested in illustrating a book about edible and medicinal plants of the Southwest. The advance they offered was more money than Grace had ever had at one time, enough to buy them security for several months. Zachary was proud of her success in a way that Grace found deeply touching. He showed her published work to people they met on the road, bragged about his wife's talent to anyone who would listen. He never seemed threatened by her growing reputation or resentful of the time she spent on her art. Instead, he supported her work practically by making sure she had supplies, by identifying safe locations for her to sketch, by respecting when she needed quiet focus. In return, Grace tried to support Zachary's work even when it frightened her. She learned to shoot a rifle so she could protect herself when he was gone. She learned to read the land the way he did, to spot signs of danger, to trust her instincts about people and situations. She never tried to make him take safer work or guilt him about the risks he took. She knew his nature as clearly as she knew the structure of a flower, and she would not try to prune him into a different shape. But there were hard times too, moments when the reality of the life they had chosen crashed against them. 6 months into their marriage, Zachary took a job tracking down a murderer who had killed a rancher's daughter. He was gone for 3 weeks, and when he returned he was different, haunted by what he had seen and what he had been forced to do. He would not talk about the details, just held Grace in the darkness and tried to scrub the memories from his mind. Grace did not push him to share what he was not ready to discuss. Instead, she drew him. She sketched his hands clenched in sleep, the tension in his shoulders, the shadows under his eyes. She was documenting his pain the way she documented everything else, trying to understand it by capturing it on paper. When he finally saw the drawings weeks later after the worst of the darkness had passed, he looked at them for a long time without speaking. "You see everything, do not you?" he said finally. "I see you," Grace replied. "All of you, not just the easy parts. And you stay anyway." "Of course I stay. You think I married you believing life would be simple. I knew who you were from the beginning, Zachary. I am not here for easy. I am here because you are worth the complicated parts." There were other challenges too. They faced people who disapproved of their unconventional lifestyle, who thought a woman should not be traveling around the territory without a proper home. They faced periods of financial strain when work was scarce and Grace's commissions were delayed. They faced the simple daily friction of 2 independent people learning to build a life together, all the small compromises and adjustments that marriage required. But through it all, there was love. Grace would look up from her sketching to find Zachary watching her with an expression of such tender wonder that it took her breath away. Zachary would return from a dangerous job, and the first thing he did was gather Grace into his arms like he needed to confirm she was real and solid and still there. They fought sometimes, sharp disagreements about money or safety or future plans, but they always came back to the fundamental truth that they chose each other, chose this life, chose the beauty they found in their particular form of partnership. A year into their marriage, Grace realized she was pregnant. The discovery filled her with a complicated mix of joy and terror. She had never particularly imagined herself as a mother, had been so focused on her art and independence that children had seemed like something other women wanted. But carrying Zachary's child felt right in a way she had not expected, like another form of creation, another way of bringing something new and beautiful into the world. Telling Zachary was one of the more vulnerable moments of her life. They were camped outside a small town in Arizona territory, sleeping under stars because the local boarding house had been full. Grace lay in their bedroll looking up at the vast canopy of sky and finally found the courage to speak. "I am pregnant," she said quietly. Zachary went completely still beside her. Then he rolled toward her, propping himself up on one elbow to look at her face in the moonlight. "Are you certain?" "As certain as I can be without seeing a doctor, yes. I missed my monthly course and I have been ill in the mornings and certain smells bother me that never did before. All signs point to a baby. How do you feel about it?" His voice was carefully neutral, trying not to impose his own reaction on her. Terrified, excited, uncertain. All of it at once. Grace placed a hand on her still flat stomach. I never planned for this. I do not know how to be a mother. I do not know if I will be any good at it. You will be extraordinary at it. Zachary covered her hand with his own. You notice things other people miss. You find beauty in small details. You are patient and creative, and you do not give up when something is difficult. Those are exactly the qualities that make someone a good parent. What about you? Are you happy about this? Happy does not begin to cover it. His voice cracked with emotion. Grace, I thought I would spend my whole life alone, moving from place to place without anything to anchor me. Then I found you, and you gave me a reason to think about the future instead of just surviving the present. Now we are making a person together, someone who will be part both of us. How could I be anything but overjoyed? They held each other and made plans in whispers. They would need to settle in one place, at least for a while. Somewhere Grace could safely have the baby, and they could establish something like a home base. Zachary could still take jobs in the area, but he would avoid anything that took him too far away or for too long. Grace could continue her botanical work, perhaps even more effectively if they were stationed somewhere for an extended period. They chose Silver City, a town large enough to have a real doctor and small enough that they could afford to rent a house. It was not permanent, they told each other, just a temporary arrangement to get through the pregnancy and the baby's early months. But as they settled into the small adobe house on the edge of town, Grace felt something unexpected happen. She began to think of it as home. She set up a workspace in the room that got the best light, spreading her sketches and supplies across a table Zachary built for her. She organized her completed plates and her works in progress, created a system for tracking her commissions and correspondence with editors. It felt good to have space dedicated to her art, to not be working out of a saddlebag or in whatever corner she could find. Zachary found work as a deputy sheriff for Silver City, a more stable position than his usual freelance jobs. He still occasionally took outside work when something paid particularly well, but mostly he stayed close, unwilling to be far from Grace as her pregnancy progressed. She could see the effort it cost him, the restlessness that built when he spent too many days in one place, but he never complained. He chopped wood and fixed things around their little house and made sure Grace had everything she needed. The pregnancy was not easy. Grace was sick for the first several months, struggling to keep food down, exhausted in a way that made even sketching feel like too much effort. But Zachary was patient and supportive, bringing her the bland food she could tolerate, sitting with her while she worked through waves of nausea, never making her feel weak or burdensome. As she entered her second trimester and the sickness faded, Grace found herself sketching with renewed energy. But now, instead of just plants, she found herself drawing what she imagined their child might look like. A baby with Zachary's green eyes and her dark hair. Small hands reaching for wildflowers. A child who would grow up understanding that beauty existed everywhere if you learned to see it. Their son was born on a cold January morning in 1880, after a labor that lasted 16 hours and left Grace exhausted but euphoric. Zachary had refused to leave her side despite the doctor's protests that childbirth was no place for a man. He held her hand through every contraction, wiped sweat from her forehead, and whispered encouragement when she thought she could not continue. When the baby finally emerged, red-faced and screaming with impressive lung capacity, Zachary cut the cord with shaking hands and then sat beside Grace's bed with tears streaming down his face as he held his son for the first time. "He is perfect," Zachary said, his voice thick with emotion. "Grace, He is absolutely perfect." They named him Theodore after Grace's mother's father, who had been the only member of her family to support her interest in art. Theodore Olsen, born with a full head of dark hair and eyes that would eventually settle into the same green as his father's. He was a hungry baby, nursing with single-minded determination, and Grace found motherhood both harder and more rewarding than she had imagined. The first months were a blur of sleepless nights and constant feeding, of learning to interpret different types of cries and figuring out how to keep a tiny human alive. Grace's art fell by the wayside temporarily, not because she wanted to abandon it, but because she simply did not have the energy or the free hands to sketch. She felt herself disappearing into the identity of mother, losing the edges of the person she had been before. It was Zachary who noticed and intervened. One morning when Theodore was 3 months old, he took the baby and told Grace to go sketch for the day. She protested that Theodore needed her, that she could not just leave, but Zachary was firm. "Theodore needs a mother who is whole and happy, not one who has sacrificed everything she loves. Go draw your plants. I can handle a baby for a few hours." Grace went, feeling guilty at first, but within an hour of sitting in the desert with her sketchbook, she felt herself coming back together. She was still Theodore's mother, but she was also still Grace, still an artist, still someone who found meaning in capturing the architecture of a yucca flower or the precise gradation of color in a penstemon bloom. She returned home late that afternoon to find Zachary asleep on the sofa with Theodore sleeping on his chest, both of them breathing in sync. The sight of them together, her restless cowboy finally still with their child secure in his arms, made her heart ache with love. They developed a new rhythm after that, one that allowed Grace to continue her work while also being present for Theodore. Zachary adjusted his schedule to be home more, taking shorter jobs that paid less but kept him closer. They learned to trade off child care, to support each other's needs, to make space for both the practical demands of raising a child and the individual dreams that had brought them together in the first place. As Theodore grew from infant to toddler, Grace documented him with the same careful attention she gave to Wildflowers. She sketched his tiny hands grasping at toys, his first unsteady steps, the look of concentration on his face as he examined a beetle with his father. These sketches were not for publication or commission. They were just for her, for them, a visual record of their family's growth. Theodore proved to be a curious child, fascinated by the natural world in ways that delighted both his parents. Before he could talk in full sentences, he was pointing at birds and plants, demanding to know what they were called. Zachary taught him animal tracks and how to move quietly through the desert. Grace taught him plant names and let him make his own marks on paper with charcoal, encouraging his creative impulses. By the time Theodore was 3, they had settled into a life that worked surprisingly well. They stayed in Silver City, but took trips as a family, camping in the desert and mountains, exploring the territory together. Grace continued her botanical work, now with the added challenge of managing an energetic toddler, but Theodore proved to be surprisingly patient when his mother needed to sketch. Zachary had built a reputation as a reliable deputy, respected but not constrained by the position. They had been married 5 years when Grace realized she was pregnant again. This time the news did not terrify her the way it had the first time. She knew what to expect, knew she could handle the challenges of another child, knew that Zachary would be there supporting her through it all. Their daughter was born in the fall of 1883, an easier birth than Theodore had been, as though their bodies had learned how to work together. She had Grace's dark eyes and Zachary's smile, and they named her Margaret after no one in particular, just because they both liked the name. Margaret was a calmer baby than Theodore had been, content to watch the world with solemn attention rather than demanding constant interaction. Theodore was fascinated by his baby sister, gentle and protective in ways that surprised Grace given his typical boundless energy. Zachary walked around looking slightly dazed by the reality of having two children, like he still could not quite believe this was his life. The years continued to pass, each one bringing new challenges and joys. Theodore started school in Silver City and proved to be bright but restless, struggling to sit still for lessons. Grace worked with his teachers to find ways to engage his active mind, suggesting they incorporate more hands-on learning, more time outside observing nature. It helped, though Theodore would always be his father's son, more comfortable moving through the world than sitting still with books. Margaret was quieter, more content with indoor activities. She liked to sit with Grace while her mother sketched, making her own pictures that showed real artistic promise even at a young age. Grace found herself teaching her daughter the same skills she had learned: how to really see what you were looking at, how to translate three-dimensional reality onto flat paper, how to find the essential truth of a subject. Zachary had stopped taking dangerous work when Theodore was born, focusing on his deputy position and occasional tracking jobs that were more puzzle-solving than gunfighting. The restlessness that had defined him for so long had eased, replaced not by stagnation but by a different kind of purpose. He still needed to move, still needed to be useful, but now his work was anchored by the knowledge that he had people waiting for him at home. Grace's career had continued to grow steadily. She had illustrated 3 books by the time Margaret was 5, and her botanical plates were sought after by journals and publishers across the country. She had developed a reputation as the premier illustrator of southwestern flora, someone who combined scientific accuracy with genuine artistry. Editors wrote to her specifically, requesting her work, offering increasingly better pay. But more than professional success, Grace had found something she had never expected to discover. She had found a life that felt authentic, that allowed her to be fully herself without apology or compromise. She was a wife, a mother, an artist, an explorer, all at once and without contradiction. The different parts of herself supported and enriched each other rather than competing for dominance. One evening when Theodore was 9 and Margaret was 6, the family sat together outside their house watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of amber and rose. Theodore was identifying bird calls while Margaret sketched the mountains in the distance. Zachary sat beside Grace, their fingers interlaced, his thumb rubbing absent circles on her palm. "You ever think about that first day?" Zachary asked quietly. "When I found you sketching that marigold, I think about it all the time," Grace admitted. "I was so determined to be alone, so certain that I did not need anyone. If you had not been persistent, if you had just ridden on like I told you to, we would never have had any of this. I could not ride on. The moment I saw you sitting there, so focused on capturing something beautiful in the middle of nowhere, I knew I had found something rare. I knew you were going to matter to me, even if I did not understand how yet." "The beauty in simple things," Grace said, echoing words from years ago. "That is what you saw in my drawing, what I have spent my whole life trying to capture. The idea that a single flower in the desert, or a moment of sunset, or a child's hand reaching for their father, those things matter. They have value even if they do not seem important to the wider world." "You taught me that," Zachary said. "Before you, I was just moving, just surviving, just going from one job to the next without really seeing anything. You taught me to pay attention, to find meaning in the moments between the crises." Theodore interrupted them then, excitedly reporting that he had identified a nighthawk's call, and Margaret wanted them to see her finished sketch. The intimate moment passed as they turned their attention to their children, but Grace held the words close. After 11 years of marriage, they still had these conversations, these reminders of what they meant to each other and how they had changed each other for the better. The years continued their steady march forward. Theodore grew into a young man who could not sit still, who talked about exploring the territories to the north, who wanted adventure and purpose the way his father once had. Grace saw so much of young Zachary in her son that it sometimes hurt, knowing he would leave eventually, knowing he had to find his own path even if she wanted to keep him safe forever. Margaret developed into a talented artist in her own right, with a style different from Grace's but equally compelling. Where Grace focused on botanical accuracy, Margaret was drawn to broader landscapes, to capturing the sweep of sky and land, the way light transformed ordinary scenes into something extraordinary. Grace encouraged her daughter's artistic development while being careful not to impose her own vision, wanting Margaret to find her own voice. Zachary aged gracefully into his 40s, silver threading through his dark hair and deepening the lines around his eyes. He had long ago given up deputy work, instead serving as a consultant when tracking or investigative skills were needed. He spent most of his time with his family, teaching his children wilderness skills, supporting Grace's work, and finally learning to be still without feeling like he was dying. Grace found that she aged with a sense of satisfaction she had never expected. Her body changed, carrying the marks of childbirth and years of hard living in the desert climate, but she did not mourn her youth the way she knew some women did. She had lived fully, had created work that mattered, had raised children who knew how to see beauty in the world. What more could she ask for? When Theodore was 18, he announced his intention to join a surveying expedition into Montana territory. Grace felt her heart clench, but she did not try to stop him. She knew he needed to go, needed to test himself against the world the way Zachary had, needed to find out who he was beyond being their son. The night before Theodore left, Zachary gave him his old Colt revolver, the one he had carried for years before settling in Silver City. "Not because I want you to use it," Zachary said gruffly, "but because sometimes having it on your hip stops you from needing to use it." Men respect a man who carries himself like he can handle trouble even if he never has to prove it. Grace gave Theodore a sketchbook and pencils. "Write to us," she said, fighting tears, "but also draw what you see. Try to really look at the places you go, not just move through them. There is so much beauty in the world, Theodore. Do not be so focused on the destination that you miss the journey." Theodore hugged them both, promised to write, and rode out of Silver City at dawn. Grace stood in the street watching until he disappeared from view, Zachary's arm around her shoulders and Margaret pressed against her side. She felt like part of her heart was riding away with her son, but she also felt a strange pride. They had raised a young man confident enough to seek his own path, and that was no small thing. With Theodore gone, the house felt too quiet. Margaret was 14 now, on the cusp of adulthood herself, spending most of her time painting or with friends. Grace found herself with time she had not had in years, space to focus on her work in ways that had been impossible when the children were young. She began a new project, her most ambitious yet. A comprehensive botanical guide to the Southwest, combining her years of careful documentation with broader context about ecosystems and plant relationships. A publisher in Boston had approached her about it, offering an advance that made Zachary's eyes widen when she showed him the letter. "This is significant," he said, reading the terms. "Grace, this could be your legacy work, the thing you are remembered for." "I hope I am remembered for more than a book," Grace said dryly. "I would like to think our children and the life we have built together matter more than my professional accomplishments. You know what I mean. This is recognition of your talent on a national scale. You have worked toward this your entire adult life." He was right, of course. This was everything she had wanted when she left Boston all those years ago. Proof that her passion for botanical art was not just a personal indulgence, but something valuable that contributed to human knowledge. She signed the contract and threw herself into the work, spending long days organizing her existing sketches and identifying gaps that needed to be filled. Zachary supported her focus by taking over more household responsibilities, cooking meals and managing their property, and giving Grace the time and space she needed to work. Margaret helped too, creating some of the landscape illustrations that would contextualize Grace's botanical plates, showing the plants in their natural environments. The work took 3 years to complete, 3 years of intense creative effort that reminded Grace of why she had fallen in love with botanical illustration in the first place. There was something meditative about the precise work of rendering plants, about capturing each detail accurately while also conveying the essential life and beauty of the subject. She loved the challenge of it, loved the way her hand knew instinctively how to make the marks that would translate a 3-dimensional living thing into a 2-dimensional image that felt equally alive. The book was published in 1896, when Grace was 43 years old. It was called Flora of the Southwest, a botanical survey in art and science, and it was beautiful, a large format volume with dozens of detailed plates and Margaret's landscape illustrations providing context. Grace's name was on the cover, her contribution acknowledged and celebrated in reviews that appeared in newspapers and journals across the country. The recognition felt gratifying but also strange. Grace had spent so many years working in relative isolation, creating art primarily for her own satisfaction and for the scientific community. To suddenly have people she had never met writing about her work, praising her talent, treating her like an important artist, was disorienting. "How does it feel to be famous?" Margaret teased one morning at breakfast, showing Grace a glowing review from a New York paper. "I am not famous," Grace protested. "The people reading these reviews are other botanists and artists, not the general public." "Still counts as famous," Margaret insisted. "My mother, the renowned illustrator. I am going to start charging people for my association with you." Zachary just smiled and squeezed Grace's hand under the table. He understood better than anyone how complicated she felt about the recognition. She wanted her work to matter, wanted validation that she had contributed something valuable, but she also valued her privacy and independence. Fame, even modest academic fame, came with expectations and demands on her time that chafed against her nature. Theodore returned from Montana 2 years after he had left, leaner and more weathered but fundamentally unchanged. He had stories about mountains and rivers, about dangerous moments and beautiful landscapes, about the hard work of surveying unmapped territory. Grace listened and sketched him as he talked, documenting the way her boy had become a man, capturing the new confidence in his shoulders and the depth in his eyes that came from facing challenges and surviving them. He stayed in Silver City for a few months, but Grace could see he was restless, already planning his next adventure. Like his father, Theodore was not built for staying still. Unlike his father, he had never experienced the loneliness that came with constant wandering, because he had always known he had a home to return to, people who loved him unconditionally. When Theodore announced he was joining a geological survey headed to Alaska, Grace felt a now familiar clench of worry but also acceptance. This was who her son was, who he was meant to be. She hugged him goodbye and reminded him to write, to stay safe, to look for the beauty in simple things wherever his travels took him. Margaret, meanwhile, showed no interest in leaving Silver City. She had fallen in love with a young teacher at the local school, a quiet man named Peter who shared her love of art and literature. Grace liked him, appreciated his gentle nature, and the way he looked at Margaret like she was the most fascinating person in the world. When Peter asked for Margaret's hand in marriage, both Grace and Zachary gave their blessing. The wedding was a small affair, family and close friends gathering in the church. Grace and Zachary had been married 17 years earlier. Margaret was radiant in a simple white dress, and Peter could not stop smiling, and Grace cried tears of joy and loss combined. Her baby girl was grown now, starting her own life, and while Grace was happy for her, she also felt the sharp edge of time's passage. After Margaret married and moved into a house 3 streets away, Grace and Zachary found themselves alone together for the first time since Theodore's birth. The house felt enormous and too quiet, and they rattled around in it like marbles in a jar. "We could travel," Zachary suggested one evening. "No children to worry about, no obligations keeping us here. We could explore, see parts of the territory we never made it to before." Grace considered it. Part of her loved the idea of returning to those early days of wandering, of discovering new plants to document, of having adventures with just the two of them. But another part of her had grown attached to their home, to the stability they had built, to being close enough to Margaret to visit regularly. "What if we did both?" she proposed. "Spend part of the year traveling, part here. We are not so old yet that we cannot handle camping and long rides, but we are also old enough to appreciate a comfortable bed and a familiar kitchen." They did exactly that, developing a new pattern for this next phase of their life. In spring and fall, when the desert was most beautiful, they traveled. They explored the high country of northern New Mexico, spent weeks in the canyons of Arizona, even ventured into Utah and Colorado. Grace sketched constantly, filling notebooks with observations and drawings, gathering material for potential future projects. In summer and winter, when the weather made travel less pleasant, they returned to Silver City. Grace worked on turning her field sketches into finished plates. Zachary took on occasional consulting work, helped Margaret and Peter with projects around their house, enjoyed being a grandfather when their first child was born. They had built a good life, Grace reflected, one that honored both who they had been when they met and who they had become together. The turn of the century found Grace and Zachary in their late 40s, still healthy and active but aware that they had passed into the second half of their lives. Theodore had settled in Seattle, working for a surveying company and writing letters full of descriptions of the Pacific Northwest's dramatic landscapes. Margaret had 3 children now, keeping her busy, but still finding time for her painting. The house that had once echoed with childish laughter now hosted grandchildren's visits, cycles repeating and renewing. Grace continued her botanical work, though at a slower pace now. She had proven everything she needed to prove professionally. Now she created primarily for the joy of it, for the meditative pleasure of careful observation and precise rendering. She taught illustration to a few select students in Silver City, passing on knowledge and technique to a younger generation. Zachary had finally, truly settled. The restlessness that had defined him for so long had eased into contentment. He no longer needed to be constantly moving to feel alive. He had found purpose in family, in supporting Grace's work, in mentoring young men in Silver City who needed guidance, in the quiet satisfaction of a life well lived. They were sitting outside one spring evening, much as they had on their first night together in Hachita 25 years earlier, watching the sunset transform the desert into gold and shadow. Grace had her sketchbook out, capturing the way light hit the distant mountains, but mostly she was just enjoying the moment. "You remember what I said that first day?" Zachary asked. "About you seeing beauty in simple things." "I remember everything about that day," Grace replied. "It changed my entire life." "Mine too. I was so lonely before you. I did not even realize how lonely until I met someone who understood what I was seeing, who could show me there was meaning in moments I had been treating as just empty space between destinations. We saved each other, I think. I was running from a life that did not fit, but I was running toward isolation that would have destroyed me eventually. You gave me a reason to stop running, to build something instead of just escaping. And you gave me a reason to stay, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. That is the difference. With you, staying still does not feel like dying. It feels like living deliberately, like choosing where to plant roots matters. Grace set down her sketchbook and took Zachary's hand, their fingers interlacing automatically after so many years of reaching for each other. His hands were more weathered now, marked by age and hard work, but they were still the hands that had helped her onto rocks that first day, that had built her a drawing table, that had caught their children when they took their first steps. "I love you," she said simply. "I have loved you since that first week in Hachita, when you looked at my drawings and saw what I was actually trying to capture. I will love you until the last breath leaves my body." "And I love you," Zachary replied. "You made me believe that beauty matters, that paying attention to small things is not a waste but the whole point. You taught me that a life can be built on appreciating simple gifts, that meaning is not found only in dramatic moments, but in the daily choice to really see what is in front of you." They sat together as the stars emerged one by one, as they had done countless times over the past quarter-century, and Grace felt a profound sense of gratitude. Her life had not been easy or conventional, but it had been authentically hers. She had created art that mattered, had raised children who knew how to find beauty in the world, had loved and been loved by a man who understood her completely. The lonely cowboy had found her sketching wildflowers, had seen the beauty she found in simple things, and it had captured him as surely as she captured images on paper. From that chance encounter in the New Mexico desert, they had built something rare and precious, a love that honored both their independent spirits and their deep need for connection. As night settled fully over the desert and Grace's grandchildren's laughter drifted from Margaret's house down the street, she picked up her sketchbook one more time. She drew what she saw in that moment: Zachary's profile against the darkening sky, the distant mountains, a single wildflower blooming stubbornly in the harsh ground near their porch. She drew the beauty in simple things, the lesson she had been learning her entire life, the truth she would continue to seek until the end of her days. And beside her, his hand in hers, the lonely cowboy who had learned to stay smiled at the stars and knew he was finally, completely home.